On the edge of Lagos State, Nigeria, facing the restless waters of the Atlantic, there rises a vast industrial complex of pipes, towers, tanks, and chimneys that glint in the tropical sun. It is an industrial city in its own right, larger than many Nigerian towns, a landscape of steel and concrete stretching across thousands of hectares. This is the Dangote Refinery, hailed as the largest single-train oil refinery in the world, and perhaps the most ambitious industrial project ever attempted on African soil. More than just a refinery, it is a symbol of Nigeria's unyielding paradox, the wealth of oil coupled with the poverty of refined fuel, and of one man's determination to transform that paradox into opportunity. The story of the Dangote Refinery is deeply bound to Nigeria's larger story, for the country has long lived in the shadow of petroleum. Oil was first discovered in Oloibiri, in the Niger Delta, in 1956, just 4 years before independence. The discovery brought hope of prosperity, but soon proved a double-edged sword. Oil revenues became the backbone of Nigeria's economy, but the country quickly developed a dependency that economists later described as the resource curse. Crude oil was exported in massive quantities, while refineries at home fell into disrepair. By the late 20th century, Nigeria was paradoxically both one of the largest oil producers in Africa and one of the largest importers of refined fuel. Petrol queues, scarcity, and corruption around fuel subsidies became the everyday reality of Nigerian life. The state-owned refineries in Port Harcourt, Warri, and Kaduna were meant to solve this problem. Built in the 1970s and 1980s with grand ambition, they were designed to refine hundreds of thousands of barrels per day. Yet mismanagement, corruption, and neglect rendered them nearly useless. By the 1990s, they were operating at a fraction of capacity. Successive governments poured billions of dollars into their maintenance, but little changed. Nigerians joked that the refineries were like mythological creatures, always spoken about, never seen working. Instead, vessels laden with imported petrol docked at Nigerian ports, and fuel subsidies drained the public treasury. This is the context in which Aliko Dangote's audacious idea emerged. Dangote was no ordinary businessman. Born in 1957 in Kano into a wealthy merchant family, he had built a commercial empire that touched the lives of virtually every Nigerian. Through the Dangote Group, he dominated the cement industry, controlled much of the salt and sugar trade, and became the face of African capitalism. By the early 2000s, he was already the richest man in Africa, his fortune measured in billions. But wealth alone did not satisfy him. He was driven by a desire to build things on a grand scale, to create not merely profitable enterprises but monuments of industry. Around 2013, Dangote announced his intention to build a refinery unlike any seen before on the continent. It would have the capacity to refine 650,000 barrels of crude oil per day, enough to meet Nigeria's domestic demand and still export surplus products. It would produce petrol, diesel, kerosene, and aviation fuel, as well as petrochemical products like polypropylene. It would generate its own power with turbines producing hundreds of megawatts. It would have a deep-sea port to handle the arrival of crude oil and the export of refined goods. It would be, in short, a city of oil. At first, many dismissed the plan as fantasy. Private refineries in Nigeria had long been stifled by regulation, politics, and entrenched interests. The financial scale was staggering, eventually exceeding $18 billion, and the engineering challenges were immense. Importing equipment so large that ports and roads had to be rebuilt to accommodate them, training tens of thousands of workers, and managing a project that stretched across 2,500 hectares of land in the Lekki Free Trade Zone. But Dangote was undeterred. His cement empire had already shown he could succeed where others doubted him. The refinery became his obsession, his personal bet on Nigeria's future. The construction began in earnest in 2016, and soon the Lekki Peninsula transformed into a theater of industry. Night after night, Lagosians watched enormous vessels bring in cargoes of steel, columns, and reactors from across the world. Roads were shut to allow gigantic vehicles with hundreds of wheels to crawl through the city, carrying equipment that weighed hundreds of tons. Workers came from across Nigeria and from as far afield as India and China, turning the site into a polyglot camp of engineers, welders, and technicians. The refinery became a spectacle in its own right, an object of curiosity, pride, and sometimes skepticism for ordinary Nigerians. As the years passed, the refinery took shape, but not without delays. Deadlines slipped again and again. Initially promised for 2019, the completion date was pushed to 2021, then to 2022, and finally to 2023. Critics argued that the delays proved the folly of the project, while supporters countered that a plant of such unprecedented scale was bound to encounter challenges. Financing, too, was a constant battle. Dangote poured billions of his personal fortune into the refinery and secured massive loans from Nigerian and international banks. He mortgaged his empire on the belief that once the refinery came online, the revenues would more than repay the costs. At its heart, the refinery project was not simply about fuel. It was about Nigeria's national psyche. For decades, Nigerians had lived with the humiliation of being unable to refine their own oil. Fuel shortages were a national embarrassment, and the subsidy regime drained billions that could have been spent on schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. The refinery promised liberation. Nigeria would finally refine at home, control its energy supply, and even export to the rest of Africa. The project also promised jobs, tens of thousands during construction, and thousands more once operations began. It was, in Dangote's telling, an act of nation-building as much as a business venture. When the refinery was inaugurated in May 2023, the moment was laden with symbolism. President Muhammadu Buhari, in one of his final acts before leaving office, hailed it as a game-changer for Nigeria and Africa. Heads of state from across the continent attended the ceremony, underscoring its regional importance. For Nigerians watching on television or reading in newspapers, it was a moment of pride. At last, the country had built something world-class, something to rival the industrial complexes of Asia or the Gulf. The refinery's potential impact is vast. Nigeria has long spent tens of billions of dollars annually importing refined fuel. If the refinery operates at full capacity, those imports could end, saving the nation precious foreign exchange. Moreover, Nigeria could become a net exporter of refined products, supplying West Africa and beyond. The refinery could stabilize fuel supply, reduce smuggling, and perhaps, if properly managed, ease the financial burden of subsidies. The petrochemical complex could stimulate manufacturing industries, providing raw materials for plastics and textiles. The deep-sea port could turn Lekki into a hub of global trade. In short, the refinery has the potential to catalyze a new era of industrial growth. Yet questions remain. The refinery is privately owned, meaning its pricing and operations will reflect Dangote's commercial interests as much as national policy. Some fear that one man, however patriotic, wielding such immense influence over Nigeria's most vital sector, creates risks of monopoly. Others worry about the refinery's long-term relevance in a world shifting toward renewable energy and decarbonization. Will such an enormous investment in fossil fuels prove wise in an age of climate crisis? And what of Nigeria's political culture, often marred by corruption and mismanagement? Can the refinery's benefits truly reach ordinary citizens, or will they be captured by elites? Still, whatever the future holds, the Dangote Refinery has already altered the psychological landscape of Nigeria. It has proven that the country can execute projects of global stature, that Africa can produce not only raw materials but world-class industrial facilities. For Dangote, it cements his place in history, not merely as a wealthy businessman, but as a nation builder whose vision reshaped the country's industrial base. For ordinary Nigerians, it remains a source of both pride and expectation. They queue at filling stations, hoping that one day those queues will vanish because of the giant refinery rising by the sea. The refinery, then, is more than pipes and towers. It is a story of ambition against doubt, of private initiative filling the void of public failure, of a continent seeking to claim its rightful place in the global economy. Whether it fulfills its promise depends on forces larger than one man or one company. Global oil markets, Nigerian politics, the pace of energy transition. But even now, it stands as one of the boldest industrial undertakings in modern Africa. A monument not only to Aliko Dangote's wealth, but to the possibility of Nigeria dreaming and building on a vast scale. Thanks for watching this edition of Back in History, a platform where we make documentaries for today and tomorrow. Click the subscription button to be a part of this family, and do remember to share our videos with friends and loved ones.